Hello everyone, welcome to the first episode of our new YouTube channel called Polarizing Political Economy to help people understand the economy and its relationship to politics and government policy. I'm Kazashi Mamato from Columbia University Global Law, and we are coming to you today from Philosophy Hall at Columbia University. I'm very excited to have interviewed one of my great mentors in this subject, Dr. Nolt. Dr. Nolt, he's a professor of international relations at New York University, and for 23 years, a senior fellow at the World Policy Institute. That was a place that first time we met.
That's
and
right.
We worked together. And he has a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago, as well as master's in economics. And I'm very excited. We're very excited to explore his views because they are so clear and compelling, yet profoundly challenging to the conventional ways of thinking about power and the economy. Thank you very much for having time, Dr. Nolt.
My
and
pleasure.
let's start with a question that's actually the title of this episode. I'm going to ask, what is missing from economics?
Well, the main thing that's missing from economics is a broad understanding of private power and strategy. So all of my work is trying to bring private power back in. And that's, by the way, one of the reasons why I call myself a political economist rather than economist, because number one, I want to link in with the older tradition of political economy that did include private power, and also because that political part of political economy emphasizes how much the economy is power-oriented.
Right. Well, when you say private power, I want to a little bit clarify that. What do you mean by private power, and where can we find it in practice?
Yeah, well, there's at least three forms of private power, and the ones that I pay most attention to, first of all, credit power, which is the ability to expand or contract credit and decide how it's allocated.
Right.
Second one is employment power. That's the power of employers to hire people, to decide who to hire, and to give them their work tasks, to determine their work process. And the third one is pricing power, which economists, it's the only one of the three that economists pay much attention to at all, but they put it as a footnote, and that's often called market power in economics. It's about monopoly power and power over prices. But in economics, it's thought to be something that's rare, whereas I see it as much more common in the economy.
Right. Well, I think out of these three forms that you mentioned, the hardest one for most people to understand, for me personally, would be credit power.
Yes.
And I'd like ask you to elaborate a little bit more. What is exactly credit power and how we understand credit power?
Well, credit power is the fact that creditors, people who have money to lend, or institutions that have money to lend, like banks, insurance companies, and so forth, they always have an option. They don't have to lend, and they can decide who to lend to, what form, what terms, what interest rate, and they also can withdraw credit. That is, they can decide not to lend. They can decide to hold their cash. Their decisions on lending or not are fundamental to why we have a business cycle. So if you don't pay attention to credit, you're never going to understand the macroeconomy, broadly speaking.
Right. Well, considering that, you said in your book, by the way, book called International Political Economy, The Business of War and Peace, was published 2014. You mentioned in your book that the credit power makes capitalism a two-party system. What do you mean with two-party system? Are we talking about the political system or something else?
Well, of course, I've derived that term from the political system because we often talk about two parties like Democrats, Republicans, and many other countries have two political parties. But I use it in a different way when I'm talking about the economy, because when you have a credit-driven political economy like capitalism, that means that there's always going to be creditors and debtors. There's always going to be people with opposite interests. And there's also going to be people investing in different ways, either as bears or bulls, depending on which way they think asset prices are moving. So you always have contrary parties interacting and struggling with each other over the direction of the economy.
Right. Well, we'll look at this more in episode 2, I'm sure. But let's get back to our topic. And I want to ask about a little bit bulls and bears that you mentioned in your book and also in your blog and post. I want to ask, as a student of economics or IR or political economy, can I study bulls and bears in this economic textbook?
Unfortunately, not very much, because economics pretty much ignores the credit system, amazingly. Even though I would say it's the lifeblood of capitalism. In fact, all modern societies have to have a credit system. And it polarizes into bears and bulls, in part because there's always two directions that asset prices can move.
Right.
Bears are people who are betting that prices will go down, and bulls are people and institutions that are betting that prices will go up. And these are bets that are not just ideas in their heads, but actually the way in which they're doing their investments, the strategies they're using to make money will depend on what they think is going to be the direction of price movements.
Well, I mean, that is the paradox that always I have in my mind, that you mentioned credit is so important.
Yeah.
Well, why is credit so important and yet so ignored from economic textbooks?
Well, part of the reason it's ignored is because economists have, since the beginning of economics in the 1860s and 1870s, that is, since it separated from what was previously known as political economy,
Right.
Economics has always focused on just demonstrating that the economy is stable, efficient, and fair. The problem is, if you introduce credit realistically into the economic picture, you can't maintain those three conclusions. And economics has always been dedicated to that. As soon as you introduce a credit cycle into the economy, then you realize that it's inherently unstable, for example, that it's
Right.
going to have these business cycles. So it's important to the whole ideological bedrock of economics to largely
Right.
neglect credit.
Well, I want to ask actually a little bit the nature of credit. Like, how is credit disruptive?
Well, credit is disruptive because if you withdraw credit, that's the main thing that creates a downturn, that creates a crisis.
Right.
On the other hand, if there's too much credit, it's going to cause inflation, it's going to cause overheating, what's often called overheating the economy. And yet there's no real external way to regulate the credit process. It's a kind of anarchic process.
Right.
You're always going to have boom and bust cycles based on contending forces, opposing interests.
Well, does that mean that we should abolish credit in practice the way that economics made in theory?
No, I mean, economics ignores credit, but real people who want to study the economy can't do that because the credit system is inherently necessary for any advanced, complex economic system. You have to have a credit system, but let's try to understand it realistically and not just assume it away to make our models simpler or mathematically more tractable.
Well, before finishing our episode, I want to ask my last question. Well, as soon as you start talking about private power, I'm sure some people are going to hear this as kind of like a conspiracy theory. And is that the right way to look at it?
Not at all, because, in fact, this is the antithesis of conspiracy theories, which assume that there's a cabal of very powerful people who are controlling everything. I admit there are very powerful people and we should understand what they do, but the problem with the conspiracy theory way of doing it is they assume that it's one group and they're all controlling things in a certain way for a certain set of interests. What I show is that there's always contending interests. There's always checks and balances in a capitalist system, much like the way, for example, the American founders argued there are checks and balances in the American Constitution. Capitalism also has checks and balances of a different kind. But that's one of the reasons why, even though there's a lot of instability and cycles in the system, there are also limits to how far it can get out of in one direction or another.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Knoll. I'm sure it was very informative and useful for people that are interested in political economy, economics, and international relations. And we are out of time for now, but let's discuss and explore more for the next episode about private strategy that you mentioned earlier, in particular how it applies to the financial system.
All right.
And folks, if you're enjoying these videos, there's more content by Dr. Knoll on his website called polarizingpoliticaleconomy.com. You can click below. And also, please share your thoughts and comments below and any question that intrigued you the most during our conversation. Look forward to discuss more in our next episode. Bye-bye.